He didn't leave her a home. He left her a tomb. When the Duke of Fenwick dumped his new bride at the rotting gates of Dunridge Castle, he handed her a title colder than the northern wind and rode away without looking back. He expected her to fade into the damp stone, a forgotten footnote in his family ledger. He was wrong, because when you lock a woman in the dark, she doesn't just learn to see, she learns to build a fire. The marriage contract smelled of melting wax and damp wool. Beatrice remembered that scent perfectly, even 3 weeks later, as the carriage violently jolted over the rutted excuse for a road leading to Dunridge. Alistair, the Duke of Fenwick, had not accompanied her. Their entire courtship had been a transaction brokered in hushed, hurried whispers between her bankrupt father and Alistair's solicitors. The wedding was a blur of stiff velvet and colder vows. At the church steps, Alistair had turned to her. His eyes were the color of slate, giving nothing away. "The title is yours," he had said, his voice flat, devoid of malice but equally devoid of warmth. "Dunridge is yours. The allowance will be transferred quarterly. Do not expect me to write, and do not expect me to visit. You have your freedom, Duchess. I have mine." He had swung onto his black gelding and vanished into the London fog. Now, Beatrice stared out the carriage window at her freedom. Dunridge Castle loomed against the bruising purple sky of the northern twilight. It wasn't a romantic fortress. It was a brutalist pile of black stone, half choked by dead ivy, sitting on a crag that looked like a jagged tooth. The wind didn't sing through the valley. It screamed. When the carriage finally lurched to a halt in the muddy courtyard, no footman came to open the door. Beatrice wrestled with the heavy brass handle herself, the metal freezing against her bare palm. She stepped out into ankle-deep freezing mud. Her velvet traveling cloak, meant for a brisk London autumn, offered zero protection against the biting, wet chill of the north. The heavy oak doors of the keep were cracked open. Inside, a single flickering lantern illuminated a cavernous entrance hall. The air inside smelled of wet ash, rat droppings, and centuries of neglect. A hunched man in a moth-eaten coat shuffled forward. He didn't bow. He just stared at her. "I am the Duchess of Fenwick," Beatrice said. Her jaw trembled. Not from fear, she realized with a sudden sharp clarity. From the cold. "Aye," the man grunted. "I'm Cobb, caretaker. Weren't expecting you till spring. Or ever, really." "Show me to my rooms." Cobb led her up a grand staircase where half the wooden banister had been scavenged for firewood. Her leather boots echoed too loudly against the stone. The silence in the castle was absolute, pressing against her eardrums like physical weight. Her bedchamber was a vast, drafty cavern. The hearth was black and cold. A massive four-poster bed sat in the center, stripped down to a lumpy ticking mattress. Dust hung heavy in the stale air, coating the single table and the cracked wash basin. Cobb set a candle on the table. "I'll fetch a bucket of coal, if the rats ain't got to it." He shuffled out, leaving her alone. Beatrice stood in the center of the room. The silence rushed back in. She was 19. She was miles from anyone she knew. She had a title that meant nothing up here, and a husband who had discarded her like a Reed newspaper. The predictable, heroic thing to do would be to square her shoulders and vow to conquer the world. Instead, Beatrice sat down on the bare, dusty mattress, pulled her knees to her chest, and threw up into the cracked wash basin. The sour smell of bile mixed with the damp dust. She wiped her mouth with the back of her trembling, velvet-clad arm. She was angry. A deep, ugly, suffocating anger that tasted like copper in the back of her throat. She hated her father for selling her. She hated Alistair for buying her and throwing her away. The candle flickered, throwing long, distorted shadows against the peeling plaster. Cobb returned half an hour later with a bucket of wet, dusty coal. He dumped it into the grate, shoved some damp newspaper beneath it, and struck a match. The fire smoked terribly, choking the room with a bitter, eye-watering haze before catching weakly. "Dinner?" Beatrice croaked, her throat raw. "Ain't none," Cobb said, not looking at her. "Pantry's bare. Got some hardtack and a bit of pale cheese in my quarters. I'll bring it up." He brought it up on a chipped wooden board. The cheese smelled of feet. The bread was hard enough to crack a tooth. Beatrice ate every crumb. She chewed mechanically, staring at the pathetic, smoky fire. She didn't cry. Crying expended heat, and she was freezing to her bones. She wrapped herself in her traveling cloak, lay down on the dusty mattress, and stared at the stone ceiling. "Dunridge is yours," Alistair had said. "Fine," Beatrice whispered to the empty room. "It's mine. Winter in the north didn't arrive. It attacked." By her second week, Beatrice stopped wearing the stiff corseted dresses she had packed. They were useless. Instead, she layered rough woolen skirts, thick knit sweaters scrounged from trunks in the attic, and an oversized sheepskin coat she found abandoned in the stables. She also found out why the castle was rotting. The estate manager, a man named Mr. Hatcher, lived in a comfortable, well-heated cottage in the village 3 miles away. He arrived at Dunridge 2 weeks after Beatrice, smelling of gin and roasted pork, clutching a ledger that looked suspiciously thin. Beatrice received him in the library. It was the only room she had managed to partially warm, mostly by burning broken chairs in the massive fireplace. Hatcher smiled patronizingly, a greasy, sliding expression. "Your Grace, a terrible shock finding you here. The Duke usually leaves the running of the estate to me." "Sit down, Mr. Hatcher," Beatrice said. She didn't offer him tea. She didn't have any. She opened the ledger. It was a masterpiece of sloppy forgery. Grain yields reported at half their actual volume, rents collected but unaccounted for, roof repairs billed to the Duke's quarterly allowance but never executed. Beatrice dragged a soot-stained fingernail down the column of ink. She didn't know much about estate management, but she knew basic arithmetic, and she knew when a man was stealing. "Where is the £50 allotted for the South Tower roof last October?" she asked. Her voice was flat. She had spent the last 2 weeks hauling buckets of rainwater out of the south corridor. Hatcher shifted. The gin sweat beaded on his forehead. Materials, Your Grace. Delays. The weather. You are dismissed, Mr. Hatcher." He blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "You are fired. Pack your ledgers and leave my property by nightfall. If you attempt to collect another penny of rent from the tenants, I will write to the magistrate in York and have you arrested for embezzlement." Hatcher stood up, his face flushing an ugly purple. "You cannot dismiss me. The Duke hired me. You are just a—" "I am the Duchess of Fenwick," Beatrice interrupted. She stood up. She was covered in soot. Her hair was tied back with a frayed piece of twine, and she smelled of smoke and cheap lye soap, but her eyes were hard. "And Dunridge is mine. Get out." He left. That night, Beatrice sat on the floor of the library, the real estate map spread around her, a singular candle illuminating the borders of her domain. She had a castle falling apart, no staff save for the useless cob, no manager, and winter howling outside the frosted window panes. She felt a brief, terrifying spike of panic. Then she reached for a blank piece of paper and began to make a list. The transformation didn't happen in a montage. It was excruciating, physical labor. First came the cleaning. The allowance from London finally arrived, barely enough to cover the stolen funds, but enough to hire a few girls from the village. Beatrice didn't sit in a parlor directing them. She couldn't. The cold demanded movement. She learned the caustic, burning smell of lye soap. It cracked the skin around her knuckles, leaving them raw and bleeding. She scrubbed centuries of grime from the grand staircase, her knees aching against the unforgiving stone. She learned the sound of a stiff, bristled brush against oak. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It became the rhythm of her days. They tackled the kitchens first, sweeping out the rat nests, re-seasoning the massive iron stoves. The first time Beatrice successfully baked a loaf of bread, the crust was burnt black and the center was doughy. She sat on the kitchen floor and ate it anyway, savoring the yeasty, warm smell that finally, mercifully, overpowered the scent of damp ash. Spring broke the ice, turning the courtyard into a sea of mud. Beatrice hired a new steward, a quiet, missing 2 fingers veteran named Miller, who didn't smile but knew how to fix a slate roof. Together they audited the tenant farms. Beatrice rode a stubborn, hairy fell pony, her skirts hiked up, auditing sheep flocks and examining fencing. The villagers, initially suspicious of the London bride, watched her carefully. They saw a woman with dirt under her nails who didn't flinch when a sheep miscarried, and who haggled ruthlessly over the price of seed. Respect was not given, it was grudgingly earned in the mud. By her second autumn at Dunridge, the castle had changed. It was no longer a tomb. The air inside smelled of roasted garlic, drying herbs, and beeswax. The drafty corridors were lined with thick, woven rugs she had bought from a traveling merchant. The fireplaces roared with seasoned birchwood. Beatrice changed too. The pale, trembling girl in the velvet cloak was gone. Her hands were calloused. Her posture had shifted from defensive shrinking to a grounded, solid stance. She stopped looking at the road leading south. She rarely thought of Alistair. When she did, it wasn't with longing. It was a dull, fading resentment. He had thrown her into the deep end to drown. She had simply learned how to swim. She relished her autonomy. No one told her when to wake, what to wear, or how to speak. The empty castle had become her sanctuary. She was the absolute ruler of this rugged, windswept stone. She liked it that way. It was the 4th week of October, exactly 3 years and 2 months since Alistair had left her. The northern autumn was brutal this year, bringing relentless, driving rain that turned the moors to black soup. Inside, however, Dunridge was a fortress of warmth. Beatrice was in the main parlor. She was wearing a heavy woolen skirt of deep crimson and a simple white blouse, the sleeves rolled up past her elbows. Her boots were propped on the brass fender of the hearth. On her lap rested a large ceramic bowl. She was aggressively shelling peas, the satisfying snap, pop of the pods loud in the quiet room. A massive deerhound she had adopted from a tenant was snoring softly by the fire. The smell of roasting mutton and rosemary drifted up from the kitchens, mingling with the scent of burning pine. It was a Tuesday. It was perfectly ordinary. Then the dog's head snapped up. A low growl rumbled in its chest. Beatrice paused, her thumb resting on a half-open pea pod. She heard it then. The heavy, sloppy sound of hooves in the muddy courtyard, the jingle of a bridle, shouts. She frowned, setting the bowl aside. Visitors in this weather were unheard of. She walked out into the entrance hall. It was bright now, illuminated by dozens of beeswax candles in the polished brass chandeliers. The floor stones were swept clean. The heavy front doors swung open. A gust of wet, freezing wind ripped through the hall, making the candle flames dance frantically. A man stepped over the threshold. He was soaked to the bone. A heavy wool riding coat was plastered to his broad shoulders, dripping black rainwater onto the pristine floor stones. He pulled off a sodden leather riding hat, running a gloved hand through dark, wet hair. Beatrice froze halfway down the grand staircase. It was Alistair. He looked older. The 3 years had carved harsh, tired lines around his mouth. There was a jagged, fading scar along his left jawline that hadn't been there on their wedding day. He looked exhausted, cold, and thoroughly miserable. He stopped in the center of the hall, looking around. He blinked. He had expected a ruin. He had expected the damp-smelling crypt he had abandoned. Instead, he smelled roasting meat. He felt the radiating heat of a massive fire from the adjoining hall. He saw polished wood, clean floors, and light. His eyes tracked upward and landed on Beatrice. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the drumming of the rain outside and the drip, drip, drip of water from his coat onto her clean floors. Beatrice didn't feel a surge of romantic recognition. She didn't feel a flutter in her chest. She felt a sharp, territorial spike of annoyance. He was tracking mud on the stones she had scrubbed. "You're dripping," she said. Her voice cut through the large hall, calm, flat, and devoid of welcome. Alistair looked down at the puddle forming at his boots, then back up at her. His slate-gray eyes widened fractionally. He looked at her bare, calloused arms, her uncorseted waist, the smudge of flour on her cheek from baking that morning. "Beatrice?" he asked. His voice was hoarse, raspy from the cold. "That is my name, yes," she replied, slowly descending the remaining stairs. She stopped a good 10 feet away from him. The deerhound trotted up beside her, pressing its heavy head against her thigh, watching the stranger with wary eyes. Alistair trailed off. He looked entirely off balance. The cold, untouchable Duke who had discarded her on the church steps was gone. In his place was a shivering, confused man standing in a house that belonged to him on paper, but clearly not in spirit. "What are you doing here, Alistair?" she asked. She didn't call him your grace or husband. He swallowed hard. "I've come back." Beatrice stared at him, the sheer audacity of it. 3 years of silence. 3 years of cracked knuckles, frozen pipes, and balancing ledgers by candlelight. "Why?" she asked simply. Alistair hesitated. He looked away, his jaw tightening. London is no longer tenable for me. There were complications. Politics. I needed..." He gestured vaguely to the warm lit hall. "I needed to come home." Beatrice let out a short, harsh laugh. It wasn't a pleasant sound. It echoed off the stone walls. "Home?" she repeated. "You don't have a home here, Alistair." "It is my castle," he said, though there was no heat in it. It sounded like a reflex. "Is it?" Beatrice stepped closer. She could smell him now, wet wool, horse sweat, and the sharp metallic tang of exhaustion. "When you left it, it was a rotting pile of stone. It was a grave. I dug it out. I fixed the roofs. I fired your thieving steward. I bled into the floorboards of this place." She pointed a finger at his chest. "You own the deed. But this house? It's mine." Alistair didn't argue. He looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the fierce, unyielding set of her shoulders. A strange expression flickered across his face, something akin to shock, slowly giving way to a reluctant, exhausted respect. "I'm freezing, Beatrice," he said quietly. "All the fight seemed to drain out of him. And my horse is blown. Will you turn me out into the storm?" Beatrice looked at his shivering frame. She hated him in that moment. She hated that he had returned to disrupt the peace she had fought so bitterly to build. But she was not a monster. She knew what the northern cold could do to a body. "Miller will take your horse," she said coldly. "Take off those boots before you walk any further. Cobb will show you to the guest chambers in the east wing. They are drafted, but there is a fire." "The guest chambers?" Alistair asked, a brow twitching upward. "Not the master suite?" Beatrice looked him dead in the eye. "I sleep in the master suite, and I don't share my bed with strangers." She turned her back on him, walking toward the parlor. "Try not to ruin the rugs, Your Grace." Morning at Dunridge did not tiptoe in. It broke over the crags like shattered glass. Beatrice woke before dawn. The air in her chamber was sharply cold, carrying the metallic tang of impending snow. She didn't linger beneath the heavy down quilts. Lingering bred softness. She threw back the covers, her bare feet hitting the woven rug, and dressed in the dark. No corset, no silks. She pulled on thick wool stockings, a flannel shift, and a heavy charcoal-colored day dress that had been mended twice at the elbows. When she entered the kitchens, the massive iron stoves were already radiating a low, comfortable heat. Martha, a scullery maid from the village, was kneading dough with flour-dusted forearms. Miller sat at the scrubbed wooden table, a mug of black tea steaming in his gnarled hands. "The gelding threw a shoe in the mud yesterday," Miller grunted by way of greeting. "Needs the farrier, assuming His Grace intends to ride it again." "His Grace can walk to the village if he wishes to leave," Beatrice replied, pouring her own tea. The brew was bitter and strong, coating her tongue with the taste of tannin and warmth. "Where is he?" "East wing," Miller said, his eyes tracking the rim of his mug. "Cobb lit a fire in there last night, but the drafts in that corridor are wicked. Probably froze to his mattress." Beatrice took a slow sip of her tea. A dark, vindictive part of her hoped he had. Alistair did not freeze to the mattress, but he felt as though his marrow had turned to ice. He woke in a bed that smelled faintly of lavender and heavily of dust. The fire in the grate had died hours ago, leaving a pile of gray, powdery ash. Frost formed delicate, fern-like patterns on the inside of the window panes. He sat up, his joints protesting. His riding clothes from the day before were draped over a chair, still damp, stiff as boards, and smelling sharply of wet dog and horse sweat. His trunks had not arrived. He had no valet to heat his shaving water, no footman to lay out fresh linens. He wrestled his way back into the damp clothes, shivering violently as the cold fabric touched his skin. When he finally navigated the labyrinthine, unfamiliar corridors to the ground floor, he was struck again by the profound strangeness of his own house. The floors gleamed with beeswax. Tapestries that he remembered hanging in rotting shreds had been repaired and rehung, blocking the worst of the drafts. The air smelled of roasting oats and smoked bacon. He found his way to the morning room, drawn by the heat of a roaring fire. Beatrice was seated at the head of the long oak table, exactly where he, the Duke, ought to be sitting. She held a thick slice of buttered bread in one hand and a stack of estate correspondence in the other. She did not look up when he entered. The deerhound, sprawled on the hearth rug, lifted its massive head. It let out a low, vibrating rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "Quiet, Barnaby," Beatrice murmured, her eyes never leaving her letters. The dog rested its chin back on its paws, but its yellow eyes remained fixed on Alistair. Alistair stood in the doorway for a long moment. He felt remarkably foolish. He was the Duke of Fenwick. This was his timber, his stone, his fire. Yet, as he pulled out a chair halfway down the table, the scrape of the wood against the floor felt like a trespass. He sat. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The only sound was the crackle of burning birchwood and the rhythmic crunch of Beatrice chewing her toast. "Is there coffee?" Alistair asked. His voice sounded thin, scraping against his dry throat. Martha, who had just entered carrying a fresh plate of bacon, froze. She looked at Alistair, her eyes wide like a startled hare, and then her gaze snapped immediately to Beatrice. She held the plate suspended in the air, awaiting instruction. It was a micro-interaction, barely a second long, but it hit Alistair with the force of a physical blow. The servant did not obey the title. She obeyed the woman who paid her wages, who scrubbed the floors beside her, who had kept them all from starving. Beatrice finally looked up from her letters. Her slate-blue eyes met his gray ones. There was no triumph in her gaze, just a cold, flat reality. "We do not keep coffee, Your Grace," Beatrice said softly. "It is expensive to ship from York, and it spoils quickly in the damp. There is tea. Martha, pour His Grace a cup." Martha darted forward, poured the dark liquid into a cracked porcelain cup, and practically ran back to the kitchens. Alistair stared at the tea. It looked like mud. He wrapped his stiff, cold fingers around the mug, desperate for the heat. "You've managed well," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked around the room. "The castle, it's habitable." "It's a home," Beatrice corrected him, setting her bread down. The sudden sharpness in her voice made the dog twitch. "Habitable is what you leave a tenant. A home is what you bleed for." She stacked her letters, the paper crisp and loud in the quiet room. "I have accounts to settle with Miller. You may explore the grounds, Alistair, but do not interfere with the staff. They have actual work to do." She stood, sweeping past him with a rustle of heavy wool, leaving him alone at a table that felt miles long, drinking bitter tea in a house that had thoroughly forgotten him. By the fourth day, the rain turned to a vicious, driving sleet that entombed the castle in a casing of gray ice. Escaping onto the moors was impossible. Alistair was trapped indoors, a prisoner pacing a gilded, albeit rustic, cage. He felt entirely useless. He was a man accustomed to Parliament, to gentlemen's clubs filled with cigar smoke and political maneuvering, to streets choked with carriages. Here, the silence was a physical pressure against his eardrums. He tried to offer assistance to Miller in the stables, but the old veteran had simply stared at his soft, manicured hands and wordlessly handed him a pitchfork, daring him to ruin his only suit of clothes in the muck. Alistair had retreated. On Thursday afternoon, he found himself wandering the West Wing, seeking the one room he remembered having a tolerable fireplace, the library. He pushed open the heavy oak door. The room was empty of people, but completely full of Beatrice. The air was heavy with the scent of dried lavender, lemon oil, and the sharp, acidic bite of iron gall ink. The massive mahogany desk by the window, his grandfather's desk, was buried under stacks of vellum, canvas-bound ledgers, and architectural sketches of roof trusses. Alistair walked slowly to the desk, his boots making no sound on the thick Persian rug. He trailed his fingers over the edge of a massive leather-bound book lying open in the center. It was the Master Estate Ledger. He looked at the open page. It was dated 2 years prior. The left side of the page was written in a cramped, greasy hand he vaguely recognized as his former steward, Hatcher's. It detailed expenditures: 70 pounds for South Tower masonry, 40 pounds for winter grain storage. Alistair's eyes drifted to the right side, the margins. Here, Beatrice's handwriting, elegant, sharp, pressing so hard into the paper it left physical grooves, cut through the lies like a scalpel. Hatcher lies. South Tower masonry crumbled by November rain. No mortar purchased. Investigated grain silos, rotting from the base. Hatcher dismissed, recovered 12 pounds from his cottage. Sold the silver dining candelabras to York merchant to cover the deficit for winter wheat. Alistair stopped breathing. He stared at the words. Sold the silver dining candelabras. They were a wedding gift to his grandmother from the King of France. They were priceless family heirlooms. He flipped the page, his hands moving with sudden jerky urgency. December. Pipes frozen. 3 sheep dead of the cold. Sold the landscape paintings from the green drawing room to purchase 50 yards of wool for tenant blankets. February. Fever in the village. Sold the Fenwick sapphire parure to pay the physician from Leeds and purchase quinine. Alistair felt a hot, prickling wave of nausea roll through his stomach. She hadn't just cleaned the castle. She had dismantled his legacy, piece by piece, trading centuries of Fenwick history for mortar, medicine, and grain. Looking for a book, Alistair? He whipped around. Beatrice was standing in the doorway, a basket of dried kindling balanced on her hip. She wore a faded blue apron over her skirt, her hands dusted with soot. "You sold the sapphires," he said. His voice was a rasp. He pointed a shaking finger at the ledger. "You sold the candelabras, the paintings." Beatrice walked into the room, setting the basket down by the hearth with a dull thud. She didn't flinch. She didn't look guilty. She looked bored. "I did," she said, kneeling to arrange the kindling in the grate. "That was my family's heritage," he snapped, taking a step toward her, a sudden, unfamiliar anger flaring in his chest. "Those jewels have belonged to the Duchesses of Fenwick for 300 years. Beatrice stood up and turned to face him. She was smaller than him, but in that moment she seemed to take up the entire room. And they belonged to a Duchess of Fenwick who was starving to death in a freezing castle because her husband left her with a thieving steward and a bankrupt allowance," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. She closed the distance between them, stopping mere inches away. He could smell the soot on her skin, the clean sweat of manual labor. "Do you know what heritage tastes like, Alistair? It tastes like boiled shoe leather and stale water. I couldn't feed the tenants with a landscape painting. I couldn't patch the roof with sapphires. So I traded your dead ancestors' vanity to keep your living tenants from freezing in the dirt." She poked him hard in the chest with a soot-stained finger. "You left me a graveyard. I had to sell the tombstones to buy shovels. Do not dare to come into my house and lecture me on heritage." Alistair stared down at her, his anger evaporating, replaced by a hollow, sickening realization. She was right. Every word was an executioner's blade, and he had laid his own neck on the block. He stepped back, running a hand over his face. As he did, his fingers caught the edge of the jagged scar running along his jawline. Beatrice's eyes darted to the movement. She had noticed the scar the night he arrived, of course, but hadn't cared enough to ask. Now, in the stark gray light filtering through the sleet-battered windows, she saw how vicious it was. It wasn't a clean fencing slice. It was puckered, torn tissue, as if the skin had been ripped by something blunt and heavy. "What happened to your face?" she asked. The question slipped out before her pride could swallow it. Alistair dropped his hand. He looked at the floor, the fight completely drained out of him. "London politics," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual aristocratic polish. "I backed the wrong faction in the House of Lords, a dispute over the Corn Laws. I thought I was making a principled stand. My allies disagreed. They withdrew their financial backing. My creditors called in my debts all at once." He looked up at the ceiling, swallowing hard. "I lost the townhouse, Beatrice. I lost the estates in Kent. When I refused to change my vote, I was ambushed in an alley behind St. James's. 3 men with brass knuckles and a broken bottle. He touched the scar again, a ghost of a flinch crossing his eyes. They left me in the gutter, told me that if I showed my face in Parliament again, they would finish the job. I had no money, no allies, no friends. He looked back at her, his gray eyes startlingly vulnerable. I had nowhere else to go. This is all that's left. Beatrice stared at him. The arrogant duke who had discarded her on the church steps was gone. The man standing before her was broken, beaten out of his own life, seeking refuge in the very place he had condemned her to. She felt a dangerous, unwanted tightening in her chest. Empathy. It felt like poison. She didn't want to pity him. Pity was a bridge, and she had burned all bridges leading to Alistair years ago. She turned away, picking up her ledger from the desk and snapping it shut. "We are out of lamp oil," she said coldly, ignoring his confession entirely. "Use the candles sparingly tonight. I have no intention of selling the library desk to buy more." She walked out, leaving him standing in the cold, surrounded by the ghosts of the things she had burned to survive his absence. The true cold hit 2 days later. It wasn't the damp, seeping chill of autumn. It was a brutal, bone-cracking Arctic freeze that plummeted down from the Scottish Highlands, turning the very air brittle. The stones of Dunridge seemed to shrink and groan under the sheer force of it. At 3 a.m, a sound like a cannon shot violently tore through the silence of the castle. Beatrice jerked awake, her heart hammering against her ribs. She threw off the quilts, her breath pluming in the freezing air of her bedroom. She didn't bother with a dress. She pulled a heavy woolen cloak directly over her night shift, shoved her bare feet into stiff leather boots without stockings, and grabbed the lantern beside her bed. The sound had come from below, deep below. She practically flew down the grand staircase, the lantern light swinging wildly, casting monstrous shadows against the tapestries. When she reached the ground floor, she smelled it, the sharp, metallic scent of iron rust and ancient, stagnant water. The main aqueduct valve, she realized with a spike of pure terror. The ancient Roman pipes that fed the castle's rudimentary plumbing, running through the deep cellars, had frozen solid. And now, under the immense pressure of the expanding ice, one had burst. She sprinted toward the kitchen stairs that led down to the cellars. As she descended the narrow stone steps, the sound grew deafening, a roaring, hissing torrent of water. She reached the bottom landing and stopped, gasping. The cellar floor, usually packed dirt and stone, was a churning black lake. The water was already up to her shins and rising fast, swirling around the wooden crates of winter root vegetables. In the far corner, a geyser of freezing black water was blasting from a massive vertical iron pipe, spraying the vaulted ceiling. "Damn it," she hissed. The main shutoff valve, a heavy iron wheel, was located directly beneath the spray. If she didn't shut it, the entire cellar would flood, destroying their winter food supply and potentially undermining the foundations of the keep. Beatrice didn't hesitate. She waded into the water. The shock of the cold was a physical assault. It felt like thousands of burning needles plunging into her bare calves and thighs. The water dragged at the heavy wool of her cloak, threatening to pull her down. She gasped, her teeth instantly chattering so hard her jaw ached. She fought her way through the rising flood, the lantern held high, casting a jaundiced, shaking light over the disaster. She reached the pipe. The water blasting from the crack was like ice shards hitting her face and shoulders. She dropped the lantern onto a high stone ledge, plunging her bare hands into the freezing torrent to grip the iron wheel. It was massive, thick with decades of rust, and slick with the icy water. Beatrice planted her boots on the submerged stone floor, braced her shoulders, and pulled with every ounce of strength in her body. The wheel didn't budge a millimeter. She screamed in frustration, a raw, primal sound repositioning her hands. The rough, oxidized iron tore at the calluses on her palms, slicing the skin. Blood immediately washed away in the freezing spray. She pulled again, her muscles trembling violently from the exertion and the terrifying cold. Nothing. "Move!" A heavy body slammed into the water beside her. Beatrice gasped, wiping the freezing spray from her eyes. Alistair was there. He was wearing nothing but a pair of unbuttoned trousers and his riding boots. His bare chest was pale in the lantern light, muscles instantly contracted against the agonizing cold. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the rusted iron wheel. "It's rusted shut!" Beatrice shouted over the roar of the water, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "I can't turn it." Alistair shoved his hands into the spray, gripping the wheel right next to hers. He gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw corded tightly. He pulled. A low groan of effort ripped from his throat. The wheel gave a fraction of an inch, emitting a horrible metallic screech. "Together!" Alistair roared over the noise, looking at her, water streaming down his face, pasting his dark hair to his forehead. "Put your hands over mine." Beatrice didn't argue. There was no time for pride, no room for titles or resentment in the freezing, rising black water. She slapped her bleeding, freezing hands over his much larger ones. She could feel the hard tendons in his knuckles, the frantic beat of his pulse beneath the freezing skin. "On 3!" Alistair yelled. "1, 2, 3, pull!" They heaved backward. Beatrice threw her entire body weight into it, her boots slipping on the slimy floor stones. Alistair roared, his back muscles bunching under the strain. With a deafening crack that echoed off the vaulted ceiling, the rust seal broke. The iron wheel groaned and spun. Half a turn, a full turn. The geyser of water immediately lost pressure, shrinking from a violent spray to a heavy gushing stream, then to a trickle, and finally stopping entirely. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by their ragged, echoing breathing and the gentle sloshing of the knee-deep water against the stone walls. Beatrice stood frozen, her hands still resting over Alistair's on the iron wheel. She was shivering so violently she could barely stand. Her wet nightshift clung to her skin, the heavy cloak pulling her downward. Alistair slowly let go of the wheel. He looked down at her hands. In the dim lantern light, he saw the blood seeping from the torn skin on her palms, mingling with the freezing water. He didn't say a word. He reached up, took the lantern from the ledge, and placed his free hand firmly on the small of her back, guiding her out of the floodwaters. They staggered up the stone stairs and burst into the kitchen. The residual heat from the massive stoves felt like walking into an oven. Beatrice collapsed onto a wooden bench by the hearth, wrapping her soaked cloak tightly around herself, shaking uncontrollably. Her lips were entirely blue. Alistair didn't sit. He moved with a sudden, frantic energy. He grabbed a massive pile of dry linen towels from a basket near the washing tubs. He threw one at her face, then dropped to his knees in front of her. Without asking for permission, he grabbed her soaking wet boots and violently wrestled them off her feet, peeling away the freezing, sodden leather. He took a dry towel and began aggressively rubbing her feet and calves, trying to force the blood back into the numbed limbs. Beatrice stared down at him. The top of his dark head was mere inches from her chest. He was shivering too, his bare skin covered in goosebumps, water dripping from his jawline onto the kitchen flagstones. His knuckles were scraped and bleeding from the rusted iron. He wasn't a duke right now. He wasn't the man who had abandoned her, and he wasn't the broken politician who had fled London. He was just a man with bleeding hands, rubbing the freezing water from her skin. Alistair looked up, pausing in his frantic rubbing. His gray eyes met hers, utterly stripped of pretense, naked in the dim firelight. The air between them suddenly felt thick, heavy with adrenaline, and something vastly more complicated than hatred. Beatrice realized with a terrifying jolt that she couldn't feel the cold anymore. The kitchen was suffused with the heavy, suffocating heat of the iron stoves, but Beatrice was shaking so violently her teeth rattled together. Alistair's hands stopped their frantic friction against her freezing calves. He knelt there, the wet towel bunched in his fists, chest heaving, his own skin mottled blue and white from the icy cellar water. He looked at her, his slate-gray eyes wide, stripped completely of the bored aristocracy he used to wear like armor. For 3 years, Beatrice had built a fortress around herself. She had patched the mortar with anger and reinforced the gates with spite. She didn't need anyone. She especially didn't need the man who had forced her to become this hardened, callous thing. But as he stared at her, the blood from his torn knuckles smearing across the rough linen towel, the fortress cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but enough to let the heat in. She yanked her foot back. It wasn't a graceful movement. Her heel caught the edge of the heavy wooden bench, and she let out a sharp hiss of pain, pulling her knees tightly to her chest beneath the soaked wool cloak. I'm fine, she managed to say. Her voice was jagged, broken by her shivering. Alistair didn't argue. He didn't offer a patronizing word of comfort. He simply stood, the movement stiff and agonizing. He walked over to the laundry drying racks hanging near the ceiling, pulled down two massive coarse woolen blankets, and walked back. He dropped one over her head, enveloping her in a cocoon of scratchy dry warmth, and wrapped the other around his own shaking shoulders. Then he sat on the bench next to her. Not too close, just near enough that she could feel the radiant heat of his body fighting the chill of the room. They sat in silence for an hour, watching the fire eat the birchwood, until the violent shivering finally subsided into a dull, exhausted ache in their bones. The next morning, the castle smelled of damp earth, rust, and vinegar. The cellar had to be pumped, a grueling, back-breaking task that involved setting up a hand-cranked siphon out the ground-level windows. Miller and Cobb managed the heavy lifting. Alistair tried to help, manning the crank for an hour before his soft hands blistered and burst, leaving him leaning against the stone wall, breathless and useless. Beatrice watched him from the top of the stairs. She felt a familiar spike of irritation. He was a gentleman playing in the dirt, but it was tempered by the memory of his weight pulling against the rusted iron wheel in the dark. By afternoon, she was back in the library. Her hands were bandaged with strips of clean cotton, smelling sharply of turpentine and beeswax salve. She was hunched over the desk, glaring at a piece of heavy parchment that had arrived from the local magistrate. "You are grinding your teeth." Beatrice snapped her head up. Alistair was standing in the doorway. He was wearing his dry clothes, a crumpled woolen jacket and trousers that looked distinctly worse for wear. "I am not," she lied, her jaw throbbing. Alistair walked into the room. He didn't ask for permission this time. He moved to the side of the desk, his eyes scanning the document she was trying to decipher. "Magistrate Davies," Alistair read, leaning closer. He smelled of lye soap and wood smoke. "He's contesting your right to fell the timber in the Blackwood Copse, claiming it falls under Crown jurisdiction due to an old boundary dispute. He is threatening to send constables to arrest my loggers," Beatrice said bitterly. "If I don't sell that timber to the shipyards in Newcastle by next month, I can't afford the seed for the spring planting. Davies knows it. He wants a bribe, a large one." She rubbed her temples, the rough bandages scratching against her forehead. "I've written to him 3 times. I cited the original land grants. He just ignores me. He knows I'm a woman alone up here, playing at being a lord." Alistair stared at the letter. A strange, sharp light entered his eyes. It was the first time Beatrice had seen him look entirely awake since he arrived. "He is using the Enclosure Act of 1773 to intimidate you," Alistair said softly. His voice lost its rough edge, taking on a smooth, dangerous cadence. "But he's misinterpreting the clause regarding contiguous woodlands." He reached across the desk. He didn't ask. He simply plucked the quill from Beatrice's bandaged fingers. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "I am completely useless with a pitchfork, Beatrice," he said, dipping the quill into the iron gall ink. "And I clearly cannot turn a rusted valve without nearly killing myself." He pulled a fresh sheet of heavy vellum toward him. "But I spent 10 years in the House of Lords tearing apart corrupt politicians for sport." The quill hit the paper. The scratching sound was furious, rhythmic, and precise. Beatrice watched him. The hesitation, the broken posture, the shivering vulnerability of the man in the cellar, it vanished. As he wrote, Alistair transformed back into the Duke of Fenwick, but he wasn't using the title to push her down. He was wielding it like a broadsword in her defense. 10 minutes later, he threw some sand over the ink, blew it off, and slid the paper toward her. Beatrice read it. It was a masterpiece of aristocratic brutality. It didn't just cite property law, it quoted specific obscure parliamentary precedents. It noted, with a chillingly polite tone, that Davies's recent tax assessment seemed irregular, and suggested that the Duke of Fenwick might casually mention these irregularities to his acquaintances in the Exchequer should the constables accidentally trespass on his wife's land. It was legal extortion, wrapped in silk. Beatrice looked up from the letter. Alistair was watching her, rubbing his blistered palms against his trousers. "Send that to him," Alistair said quietly. Your loggers will have their timber by Friday." Beatrice looked back down at the sharp, aggressive handwriting. She hated to admit it. She hated the relief that washed over her, untying the knot of anxiety in her stomach. "Thank you," she said. The words tasted like dry ash, but she forced them out. Alistair gave a short, self-deprecating nod. "It's the least I can do, since I'm eating your bread." Winter tightened its grip on the moors, burying the rutted roads in 3 feet of driven snow. For 3 weeks, Dunridge Castle was an island. The dynamic inside the stone walls settled into a fragile, cautious truce. Alistair stopped trying to perform manual labor. Instead, he took over the estate's sprawling, complicated correspondence. He dealt with the merchants in York, negotiated shipping rates for their wool, and chased down delinquent payments from distant tenant farms. Beatrice still managed the house, the physical repairs, and the staff. They operated in parallel orbits, brushing past each other in the drafty corridors, sharing silent dinners at opposite ends of the massive oak table. The hostility had evaporated, replaced by a tense, vibrating awareness. Beatrice caught herself listening for the heavy tread of his boots on the floorboards. She noticed the way the firelight caught the silver threads starting to appear in his dark hair. She noticed the jagged scar on his jawline and caught herself, more than once, wondering what the men who had put it there looked like. She hated this weakness. She scrubbed the floors harder, rode her fell pony further into the freezing wind, trying to freeze the softening out of her heart. The outside world breached their island on a Tuesday in early December. The carriage that clawed its way up the castle road was not a local wagon. It was a heavy black town carriage, its wheels chained for the ice, pulled by 4 exhausted steaming horses. Beatrice was in the courtyard, wearing her heavy sheepskin coat, helping Miller unload sacks of coarse salt for the meat cellar, when the carriage lurched to a halt. The door opened. A man stepped out into the ankle-deep snow. He did not belong here. He wore a heavy coat with a beaver fur collar, a silk cravat, and polished leather boots that were immediately ruined by the salted mud. He smelled sharply of expensive cigar smoke, a scent so foreign to Dunridge it made Beatrice's nose twitch in distaste. Behind him stepped 2 larger men, enforcers. Their coats were rougher, their eyes flat and dead as they scanned the courtyard. Barnaby, the deerhound, let out a vicious, snarling bark, the hackles on his back rising like a mohawk. Beatrice grabbed his thick leather collar, pulling him back. The man with the fur collar looked around the decaying grandeur of the courtyard, his lip curling in a sneer. His eyes landed on Beatrice, taking in her dirty coat, her braided hair, and the sack of salt by her feet. "You there, girl," the man barked, his London accent sharp and grating. "Fetch the master of the house. Tell him Mr. Carmichael has arrived from the city." Beatrice didn't move. She held the dog's collar, her slate blue eyes narrowing. "The Duke is occupied. You will state your business to me, or you will get back in that carriage." Carmichael laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "I don't do business with scullery maids. Fetch him." "I am the Duchess of Fenwick," Beatrice said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the freezing wind like a blade. Carmichael blinked, his sneer faltering for a fraction of a second before returning. "My apologies, Your Grace. The mud on your face deceived me." He pulled a thick leather folio from inside his coat. "Then perhaps you can assist me. I hold promissory notes signed by your husband, debts totaling some £40,000. Since he fled London like a beaten dog, we have come to collect. We will be taking the deed to this property, the livestock, and any liquid capital you possess." Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. £40,000. It was an astronomical sum. It would take 100 lifetimes of selling timber and wool to pay it. The courtyard doors opened with a loud creak. Alistair stood on the top step. He was wearing his only decent jacket, but his face was ashen. He looked at Carmichael, then at the 2 thugs standing behind him. The old terror, the trauma of the alleyway behind St. James's, flickered violently in his eyes. His hand instinctively twitched toward the scar on his jaw. "Carmichael," Alistair said, his voice entirely hollow. "Your Grace," Carmichael smiled, showing yellowed teeth. "Found your little rat hole, didn't we? It's a miserable pile of stones, but it will fetch a price when we strip the lead from the roof." Alistair slowly descended the stairs. the crunch of his boots on the ice loud in the silence. He stopped halfway down, placing himself between Beatrice and the men. "The estate is entailed," Alistair said, his voice shaking slightly. "You cannot seize it. We can seize the revenues," Carmichael countered smoothly. "We can seize the livestock. We can seize the very timber holding up the ceilings. Or you can come back to London with us and face the magistrate. The debtors' prison in Fleet is quite damp this time of year, I hear." Alistair closed his eyes. The fight drained out of him, leaving him looking ancient and defeated. He had run as far as the map would allow, and his failures had still caught him. He turned his head slightly, looking at Beatrice. His eyes were filled with a crushing, suffocating apology. "I'll pack my trunk," Alistair said quietly to Carmichael. "Leave the castle alone. Leave her alone. I will come with you." "Alistair, no," Beatrice breathed, stepping forward. "It's over, Beatrice," he whispered. "I won't let them tear down what you've built to pay for my arrogance. I'm going back." He turned to walk up the stairs. "Stop right there." Beatrice's voice cracked like a whip across the courtyard. Alistair froze. Carmichael raised an eyebrow. Beatrice let go of the dog's collar. She marched past Alistair, stopping 2 feet in front of Carmichael. The smell of his cigar smoke was nauseating. "You will not take a single sheep, a single piece of lead, or a single shilling from this estate," Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a register of pure, unadulterated ice. "Little girl," Carmichael sighed, gesturing to his thugs, "do not test my patience. I have the law on my side." "You have nothing," Beatrice spat. "Under the marriage settlement of 1823, heavily negotiated by my father's solicitors, if the Duke of Fenwick abandons the marital home for a period exceeding 2 years, the total revenues and management of the Dunridge estate fall into an irrevocable trust for the sole maintenance of the Duchess." Carmichael frowned. "That is an archaic loophole. No magistrate will uphold it." "I have the signed documents in my safe." Beatrice lied flawlessly, not breaking eye contact. "Witnessed by the Archbishop of York. Furthermore, this estate owes no allegiance to London creditors. The livestock is branded in my name. The ledgers are in my name. If you touch a single blade of grass on my land, I will have you arrested for highway robbery before you reach the county line." Carmichael's face darkened. He took a step forward, trying to use his height to intimidate her. "You think you can play games with us, you stupid—" Click, clack. The heavy metallic ratcheting of a double-barreled shotgun echoed through the courtyard. Carmichael froze. He looked up. Miller was standing on the stone balcony above the entrance, the massive hunting gun leveled directly at Carmichael's chest. The old veteran's face was completely devoid of emotion. Beside Beatrice, Barnaby let out a roaring bark and lunged forward, his heavy jaws snapping inches from Carmichael's silk cravat. Carmichael stumbled backward, crying out in alarm, slipping on the ice and falling hard onto his back in the mud. The 2 enforcers instantly backed away, their hands raised, wanting no part of the snarling hound or the shotgun. "Get off my property," Beatrice said, looking down at the solicitor writhing in the salted mud. "If you or your thugs ever set foot in the north again, Miller will not aim for your chest. He will aim for your knees, and then I will let the dog finish the job." Carmichael scrambled to his feet, his beautiful coat ruined, his composure shattered. He didn't say a word. He practically dove into the carriage. The enforcers scrambled onto the backboard. The driver cracked the whip in a panic, and the heavy black carriage skidded and spun its way back down the icy road, disappearing into the white out. Beatrice stood in the courtyard, her breath coming in heavy, ragged plumes of white smoke. Her hands were shaking so hard she had to shove them deep into the pockets of her sheepskin coat. She turned around. Alistair was staring at her from the steps. He looked as though he had just watched a mountain spontaneously erupt. "The marriage settlement of 1823?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper over the wind. Beatrice swallowed hard, trying to control her heart rate. "I made it up." Alistair let out a sound that was half a gasp, half a laugh. He ran a shaking hand through his hair, leaning heavily against the stone balustrade. "You bluffed them. You bluffed 40,000 pounds of London muscle with a fake legal precedent and a crippled estate manager." "Miller is an excellent shot," Beatrice defended defensively, walking toward the stairs. "And Barnaby hates cigar smoke." She reached the bottom of the steps. She stopped. She looked up at Alistair. "Why did you do that?" he asked softly, the trace of a smile vanishing, leaving his face devastatingly open. "I gave you an out, Beatrice. I offered to leave. You could have been rid of me. You could have kept your home entirely to yourself. Why did you defend me?" Beatrice looked down at the slushy mud. She hated this part. She hated the vulnerability, the exposure of the raw, beating thing inside her chest that she had tried so hard to bury beneath the stone. "Because," she started, her voice thick, "I hate seeing things broken. You left me a broken house and I fixed it. I won't let some London scum come up here and break you on my doorstep." She looked back up, her slate blue eyes fierce and entirely unapologetic. "And because it's my house, I decide who gets thrown out into the snow." That evening, the storm finally broke. The sky bruised into a violently clear purple, and the air inside the castle smelled of ozone, wood smoke, and melting ice. Beatrice sat in the library nursing a glass of harsh fermented cider. Her bandaged hands throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. The adrenaline from the courtyard confrontation had entirely evaporated, leaving her hollowed out and heavy in her chair. The heavy oak door creaked. Alistair stepped in. He had shed the damp jacket, wearing only a simple white linen shirt and rough wool trousers. He looked entirely stripped down. He carried a small, battered leather book, his personal ledger. He didn't approach the desk immediately. He stopped by the hearth, watching the birch logs pop and spit. The silence between them wasn't the suffocating, hostile pressure of his first week. It felt like a held breath. "I can't unsay what I said on the church steps," Alistair spoke to the flames, his voice raspy and low. "I can't give you back 3 years of freezing while I played political games in the city." He turned. He walked to the desk, set the small ledger on the mahogany, and reached out. He covered her bandaged hand with his bare one. His skin was hot. Calluses were just beginning to form on his palms from the rusted cellar wheel. "I am bankrupt," he said. His slate-gray eyes were entirely naked. "I have 0 political capital. I am a disgraced man with a ruined face and a bounty on my pride." He leaned in, the scent of lye soap and cold wind coming with him. "But I know the law. I know how to bleed merchants for a fair price on your grain. I know how to gut corrupt magistrates with a pen." He swallowed hard. "This is your castle, Beatrice. You bled for the mortar. I don't want to take it from you. I just want to work for it, if you'll have me." The predictable thing to do was to cry, to forgive, to fall into his arms. But Beatrice was a creature of the north now. Spring didn't arrive in a single day of sunshine. It came with weeks of agonizing, freezing mud. Trust wasn't a gift. It was masonry. She slowly slid her hand out from under his. Alistair's jaw tightened. A sharp, profound grief shadowed his face. He began to step back. "Don't flatter yourself," Beatrice said. Her voice was flat, but a tiny, involuntary twitch caught the corner of her mouth. "You don't even know how to properly bank a fire. You'd smoke us out." He froze. Beatrice tapped his ledger. "But the East Barn needs a roof. The slate merchants in Leeds overcharge on shipping. If you can negotiate a better rate by Friday, I will let you move out of the drafty guest wing." Alistair stared at her. The grief shattered. A sudden, slightly crooked smile broke across his face, pulling at the puckered scar. "The slate merchants," he repeated, his eyes catching the firelight. "Consider them ruined by dawn." "Good." Beatrice stood, walking around the desk to hand him the heavy iron poker. "Now, pay attention. I'm going to teach you how to handle the ashes." Conclusion. If the cold grit of Dunridge Castle and Beatrice's absolute refusal to back down kept you hooked, hit that like button right now. Did she make the right call making Alistair earn his place in the mud, or should she have left him in the guest wing forever? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss our next historical storytelling deep dive. Share this with someone who loves a fiercely independent protagonist, and I'll see you in the next video.